evening and welcome. The purpose of this podcast is to introduce who we are, what we do in our roles at Pitt, and our relationship to a project called ValEUs, spelled ValEUs. My name is Nancy Condee, and I'm the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies.
And I'm Zsuzsanna Magdo. I'm the associate director for the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies.
I'm Randall, Halle, the director of the European Studies Center, Jean Monnet EU Center of Excellence.
And I'm Erica Edwards, associate director of the European Studies Center and the Jean Monnet Center of Excellence.
Let me say just a word about the disciplines we represent. I'm in Slavic and Film and Media Studies, and my colleagues will briefly mention their disciplines.
I'm trained in East European history, and I work closely with Erica Edwards, who has expertise in political science with a focus on Europe.
And I work closely with Randall, Halle, who has an expertise in cinema and cultural politics.
That's me.
That's him.
Exactly.
So you can see history, political science, cinema, cultural politics, and you'll find a lot of disagreement, but plenty of ideas.
So Nancy, how did Pitt come to the ValEUs project?
I'll say it very briefly and then pass the torch to Randall, because Randall was the guiding light for this project. In my experience, at least, February 24th, 2022 was Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which stirred support for European Union's commitment to liberal and humanitarian values, but it also fueled a critique of those values. So it's precisely at that encounter of support and critique that this project sits. We managed to work out an ongoing, creative, and robust relationship between the European Studies Center, with Randall and Erica, and the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies with Zsuzsanna, Magdo, and me to launch a partnership with Viadrina, Europa University Viadrina. And I think I'll stop there and pass it along to Randall, who will talk a little bit more about it.
At that moment, we were lucky that Tim Beichelt was visiting us here at the University of Pittsburgh. And we had a discussion at that point in time about Critique and Europe that Tim participated in, and went out for lunch afterwards and started saying things about the state of the world and what we could do. And Ukraine was mainly on our minds. But we then started looking for ways to actually build up a network. And at that point, we intersected with the EU's, the Erasmus Plus Jean Monnet Network grant that was being posted at the time, which unleashed a great deal of collaboration and cooperation, not just between our two universities, but between the entire network that came into being very, very quickly and impressively to me. Yeah. So, Zsuzsa, what do you think then in this network that we have of multiple universities and multiple continents that Pitt's particular contribution to ValEUs is?
I think that the way Pitt enriches this project is through the fruitful collaboration of the European Studies Center and REES,
good idea,
for short. Both centers are recognized by the U.S. Department of Education as national resource centers for their respective world regions, and EACEA is, of course, also distinguished by the European Commission as one of the few Jean Monnet Centers of Excellence in the United States. Why do these distinctions matter? For two reasons. One, they are an indication that Pitt can marshal the resources to serve as the center of research dissemination for this network. Second, the two centers have already a significant network of over 150 early career and senior scholars from a vast variety of humanities, social science, and public policy disciplines. This community of scholars can contribute to research and teaching on issues critical to EU foreign policy. And most importantly, in this manner, we can aid the project's main aim, which is to have a policy impact with EU agencies on issues of global urgency, such as democracy, migration, and global inequality. First and foremost, however, Pitt's contribution is going to be made visible right here through the conversations that we are going to have on populism in the intra-European and international contexts, civilizational discourses and their structuring impact on national politics or foreign policy, regional concepts and identity formation, and the relationship between EU development aid and colonial legacies.
We do all that?
Yes, we do. So, Erica, you've been working on populism in your research and teaching. Could you tell us more?
Yes, I mean, I'm excited this semester because I'm actually teaching a course on comparative populism with undergraduate American students, and I've been very intrigued and impressed by their thoughtfulness of these issues, not only in Europe or in the United States, but also in Latin America, Asia, Central Asia, et cetera, et cetera. So it's been the highlight of my semester to be working with these students about this issue.
What are some of the drivers of populism that you're looking at in that class or in your own research?
So there's a lot of drivers of populism, but I want to focus just on two. And one has to do with economic insecurity, right? I think that it's important to admit that there have been real winners and losers of globalization and deindustrialization. And this has created economic uncertainty and real grievances amongst people, right? Populists tend to speak to these issues in ways that mainstream parties do not, right? And for me, when I think about the success of populist parties, I think that is not the populist, in fact, it's the failure of the mainstream parties, right? To address and tackle these very real issues of unemployment, economic inequality, housing crises, et cetera. So the mainstream populists have made the space for, the mainstream parties have made space for these populists, right? Not that I think that these populists have tangible solutions to these issues, but they at least message that they do.
But so, Erica, would you say then that populism is inherently, in and of itself, a threat to democracy? Or is it possible that populism can also play a constructive role in political discourse?
Yeah, I mean, I think at its core, populism is not undemocratic, right? It's about empowering the people who see themselves in a moral battle against the elites. The people often has significant interests and values that political elites, again, the mainstream, have often neglected or denigrated, right? And so populists want to take these democratic politics, back, right? And deal with these really, again, tangible issues that face them, right? So in a sense, populism is democracy's way of saying, listen harder, elites and mainstream parties, right? But I will say that I think that this moral antagonism inherent in populism's core elements has the potential to kind of undermine the democratic commitment of treating all members of the polity with respect, right? And so what is the general will that the populists purport to represent? Who are the ordinary people, right? For populists, particularly on the right in Europe, it's the pure people, i.e. the white and Christians, against the others, right? And this is not in line with liberal democracy, right? And so I think this antagonism undermines the capacity of democracy to kind of negotiate and compromise with others, right? It undermines this tolerance and inclusion, civility, and those kind of things that are key to pluralistic democracy. So I guess in the end, theory aside, I would say that current manifestations of populism in Europe, and again throughout the world, are characterized by homogeneity, exclusivity, greater direct rule, and nationalism, right? And these promote opposition to vulnerable outgroups. And in that sense, to me, as it stands now, in practice, populism is a threat to liberal democracy. So populism and the Europe of nations, these are actually intertwined with things that you deal with about civilization, Nancy.
Yeah, when we talk about civilization, which sounds at first glance like an innocent enough concept, but is in fact invidious and long lived, unfortunately. What I would say next is in no way an endorsement of it, but rather intended as a description. One of the horrifying things is that Huntington, for example, Clash of Civilizations, is assigned on undergraduate U.S. syllabi across universities more often than Aristotle. So we can say that Huntington's time is over and he's out of date and nobody believes him or takes him at face value, but that's by no means the case. It's a very entrenched point of view, and even more entrenched the further east that you go. Not only Huntington himself, but Halford Mackinder and that entire legacy through Brzezinski and so forth. I think that as a territorial model, it's very comforting because it's grounded in almost a Disneyland-like notion, or the puzzle pieces you had as a child, in which there are certain puzzle pieces that fit together that are colored different colors, and each color is a different nation. And you put the puzzle together and it's static, and therefore you can do things with it because it's predictable. Huntington is somewhat like that, Mackinder all the more so. And therefore it underscores and holds in place a set of values in the East, specifically normative family values, which essentially is anti-LGBTQIA, religious values, that is to say, orthodoxy and those that collaborate with orthodoxy, and state authority. In other words, a centralized notion of what the contribution of the people can be, based not on people as an active force, but rather as the folk in the Halle tradition. And so that's a very stubborn way of conducting governance in that part of the world, and it doesn't lend itself easily to getting uprooted. I think I'll leave it at that. There's a great deal to be said, but I'm afraid I'll go into a black hole on it.
So, Nancy, how do we understand the persistence of civilizations then as an effective structuring concept for right-wing politics?
I think in part because when we invoke civilizations, we're talking about large bodies of governance. Generally speaking, when we use the word civilization, we're not talking about, let's say, Moldova or Transnistria or Belarus. We may not even be talking about Poland necessarily. We're talking about large hegemonic bodies of land. And therefore, it has an authoritarian dimension to it, and it's structuring what is possible and not possible to those countries that indeed are struggling for greater autonomy, let's say, from the Russian Federation, including Moldova, Transnistria, Belarus, and in its own way, Poland as well.
But then, Nancy, how do Central European states, so civilization as big homogeneous spaces, but how do then precisely Central European states such as Moldova, Transnistria, Belarus, and Poland differently negotiate their status in the current crisis? Are they cut off from civilization? What is your thinking there?
What I see is a split. I'll try to describe it briefly. The split that I see as I watch the different websites go by each morning is that you have, on the one hand, say, Poland, Finland, Norway, that are pulling in the direction of tracking undersea cables to see when they are getting cut, or when the so-called splinter net, not the internet, but the splinter net gets even more fractured. So that cluster, Poland, Norway, Finland, are clearly oppositional, whereas Moldova, Transnistria, Belarus, for reasons that don't really need to be explained, are hunkering down and doing what they can. You can talk about Lukashenko letting out X number of political prisoners prior to his election, but that's nonsense. He's trying to stabilize his country vis-a-vis the East and West. So those two clusters, say Poland, Norway, and Finland, as different as they are, have one set of behavior patterns, whereas Moldova, Transnistria, Belarus have a different set. And of course, Ukraine goes without saying, if that's possible. But then I want to turn to another idea, which is that civilizations are, after all, not the only way that people can organize themselves and reproduce their identities. Civilizations is in an uneasy jostling match with regionalism. And I'm wondering, Zsuzsa, if you could say something about regionalism.
Sure. If we look at the catalog of political parties registered in the EU, we'll see a multiplicity of regional movements and their political counterparts, often representing ethnic minorities. with goals ranging very widely on the political spectrum, from separatism to cultural or territorial autonomy. So regionalism is definitely an important category to speak about, and civilizational discourses often have regional components.
It's interesting because in the EU discourse, there is this very common phrase, the Europe of regions, or regions of Europe, that's important there. Zsuzsanna, what is the 101 on the EU's concept of regions? How does this approach reflect regional imaginaries? Is it the same thing, regional imaginaries historically that are persistent in especially the eastern part of the EU?
Mm-hmm. Not necessarily, although the way the EU is engaging into the making of regions may rely on some historical narratives, even reconstruct them, but there are important changes that need to be attended to. The concept of Europe of regions was meant to be a way to address the democratic deficit in Europe when it initially arose. In the narrowest sense, one can think about today of EU's regional and cohesion policy, which is focused on job creation, competitiveness, economic growth, improved quality of life, and sustainable development, basically around the slogan of leave no one and no region behind. It relies, in order to implement this, the EU relies on a classification known as NUTS, which stands for Nomenclature of Territorial Units for Statistics, which is being used since 2003. And these regions are newly created functional subregions within a country that aggregate already existing administrative units at the lowest level. But these regions are created as a top-down effort for the benefit of development and integration policy, without necessarily a bottom-up accommodation of regional movements and identities. In a more expansive sense, one can also think about more recent developments in the EU's regional thinking, such as the EU macro strategies for the Baltic Sea region, which was launched in 2009, and it was the first one, the Danube region, the Alpine region, and the Adriatic Ionian regions. As in the case of the EU's regional and cohesion policy, these macro strategies also reflect the region-making work of the European Union, often clearly involving its member states, often even accession states. And they articulate new territorialities. Now, since the spatial turn in the humanities and social sciences, we understand that regions are not timeless, fixed geospatial categories, but with solid boundaries, but shifting socio-historical concepts that reflect symbolic geographies, ideologies, and changing identities. So in this sense, what the EU is engaged in is not historically unique. It is engaged in inventing regions. And in some cases, it is relying on historical narratives. I'm thinking here of the Baltic Sea region and the Danubian region, which have historical narratives reaching back to the 19th and 20th centuries. But at both of these levels, the EU's regional and cohesion policy and its macro-regional strategies are top-down efforts. And so then one must wonder, how are bottom-up initiatives being incorporated? Because we need to think about what the gap is in terms of regional policy that would be important to consider.
So kind of what would you say is the cost of that gap that you're describing?
I think in the most obvious way, it's a missed opportunity to address the democratic deficit, particularly in the context of minority rights, and also to address the challenge that the far right presents. So I'm going to think with Romania as an example. When Romania was on its path to join the EU, based on EU's regional and cohesion policy, the kinds of subregions that were created did not coincide with any historic region or locally embedded regional imaginaries. In fact, they were created in such a way as to counteract regional imaginaries. For example, Romania joining the EU was the final blow to an alliance between Transylvanian Romanian liberal regionalists and their Hungarian counterparts, who had picked up conversations after 1989 based on debates that emerged after the Austro-Hungarian imperial collapse and the formation of nation-states in post-imperial Eastern Europe. Historically speaking, neither the Hungarian or Romanian versions of Transylvanism were truly interethnic or entirely devoid of civilizational dichotomies. And here I'm turning back to a comment I've made already. However, Transylvanism did invoke European values. And on the Hungarian side, at least, where Transylvanism was always very significantly tied to minority rights and aspirations for autonomy, as many contemporary regional movements and parties in the EU are. Now, in the context of the new Europe, it's important to keep these types of regional movements in the forefront because of the region's long-standing history of being a borderland between empires, great powers, its history of shifting boundaries, and because the nation-states are still nationalizing, meaning they're undergoing processes that some of the northern or Western European countries are more advanced at, perhaps.
In a progress narrative.
Yes. Meaning they have finished ethnic cleansing and all of that much before the Eastern European
a non-progress narrative.
So, but obviously we don't want to engage in hypotheticals. We can ask provocative questions. I think my point is here that let's assume that Transylvanist regionalism had shaped regional policy in Romania and solidified interethnic cooperation, including in ways that far more marginalized minorities are included, for example, the Roma. And let's assume that thus the political aspirations of the dominant Hungarian minority have been moderated. We have to wonder whether Hungarian sociologists today who do work in Romania would be speaking about the Transylvanian Hungarian communities as being the most pro-Russian community in the country, whether Orban would have higher support among this community than within Hungary, and whether he would have been so effective in articulating a virtual unification of the Hungarian nation as he has been. And so, Randall, we have also been discussing other dynamics in Europe's relationship with the world, particularly its development aid relation with the rest of the world.
Yeah, I'm still thinking about what you just described might be how it might impact Sinti and Roma, or what role they might play there. There's a lot of questions you raised, but indeed, I think some of the things that we're all thinking about are these kinds of geospatial relations, and one of the things that makes Europe's relationship to its development aid particular and unique vis-a-vis, say, the United States and other countries that provide development aid. It's precisely that it emerged out of their colonial past. And it's interesting because most people don't know, even though there's been very good work by Pio Hansen, Stefan Jonsson about Eurafrica, But it's worth taking a note that if one looks at the Treaty of Rome, a full third of it addresses countries, that is to say, nascent countries that are about to decolonize within the next decade, that are still colonies or overseas territories that had no ability to be engaged in the process of thinking about their relationship to the EU. And that also meant that if you look at the map at that particular moment, that Algeria and all the overseas territories, the full territorial integrity of the European project at that time, the European Economic Community, was largely outside of what we consider Northern Europe. So it really was spread throughout the world, but mainly in Africa. And what's interesting for us is that as decolonization takes place, there's a rapid transformation from settler colonial projects to a transformation of the same bureaucracy that existed before, the schools, the bureaucrats, the structures of what we might call development aid in the contemporary period. They were simply the old colonial holdings, and they shifted over very quickly. And what is also telling about that is that it was largely a question of markets and making sure that the colonial market remained, in effect, in a proprietary relationship to the European six at the time, right? And what I find interesting that, again, most people don't know is that this is a moment in which the colonial banks became the central banks for those countries as they decolonized. So, and furthermore, the central banks for those decolonized states existed primarily in Paris until the 70s, until 75. And so this is a very unique configuration of a development relationship within the way that we think about development.
So kind of following up on that, when you think about the EU's development aid, is it an improvement over colonialism, or is it indifferent? I mean, how would you describe that?
You know, and that's an interesting thing, because I think one of the first things that I would underscore is a separation between, and there's sometimes I would say even a purposeful confusion of the relationship between humanitarian aid and development financing. And in effect, development financing has actually only done a great deal of work of making former colonies, now independent countries, financially dependent on international banking structures. So cycles of debt. And that's been immediately a kind of crisis point in discussion that was housed in the United Nations and beyond through the 70s, even up into the present. And what's interesting about that is that the initial, what we would say, development theory, speaking about progress, was always based in an idea of modernization, nation-state building, making places look like Europe, in effect, and understanding that it was going to result in displacement, urbanization, industrialization, and all these kinds of things that didn't actually transpire in that way, because it was always about making sure that they were connected to Europe, and in effect that they were dependent on Europe. So there was the emergence out of first a development theory to a critical development theory, because there was a recognition that this wasn't succeeding. And in fact, it was leading to failure and corruption and debt. And so critical development theory has said, well, is the problem what we do? Or is the problem that those people there are corrupt and need us to continue? And there might be something that we could describe as a further kind of post-development theory. Yeah.
I'm reminded here of the kind of ABCs of international relations, in which they talk about the 3 Ds: defense, diplomacy, and development, the last of which you've been talking about. This comes at a particularly keen time as we approach as we approach the 3rd anniversary of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine. and questions about development moving forward. It's painful to say, but I notice in the New York Times, for example, now they openly say, the analysts that are quoted, that Ukraine is losing to Russia. And this shows up in all kinds of ways that I won't take the time to enumerate here. But as we approach the third anniversary, and now we say openly that Ukraine is losing, it brings up some very painful, consequent questions. If I could characterize this conversation that we've had today as operating around 4 topics, that is to say, populism, of which Erica has spoken, civilization, about which I've spoken, regionalism, about which Zsuzsa has spoken, and developmentalism, about which you, Randall, have spoken, the question that I keep returning to towards the end of this conversation is this: is it perhaps that development should be cut entirely? Are we at a point at which we need to consider this as a real option, and particularly what are the implications of that for Ukraine?
Yeah, I will say that I've been focused in my own research on European-African relations. Mm-hmm. I think one of the things, especially at this particular moment, this historic moment in which the United States is shuttering USAID, that there are ways that we want to unpack some of what you just asked, mm-hmm. and that development, especially in the American context, is, again, often confused with humanitarian aid, but has been understood as soft power and a way of keeping an American sphere of influence out in the rest of the world. Whereas the European development financing has largely been about making sure that an extractive relationship is present in relationship to Africa in particular. Right? So I've been thinking about clean energy versus dirty mines. We get clean energy in Europe, you get the dirty mines because we're going to extract the cobalt and the lithium that we need from you and leave that behind. Ukraine is interesting because it shifted everything in terms of thinking and strategies in Europe as such. And it reveals to us in many ways that a significant aspect of development has always been about defense. Right? It sort of lays that bare. I'm interested in thinking about spheres of influence that operate at eye level. And this phrase at eye level is something that's very common in critical development literature, but it proves to be almost impossible to achieve because the recipient of development is always a recipient and a supplicant, right? And it's interesting to take Ukraine as an example. Zelensky is a master at presenting himself to be at eye level, even, or pushing himself into a position of being at eye level with players, including Trump, but with the EU, while at the same time being utterly dependent on them. Right, and I guess I wonder: is it possible for us to imagine development relations that are based first on asking and sitting down at eye level with other people and saying, "What do you need?" And I think fundamentally one of the things that's important for us here in thinking about, say, a difference between Ukraine and Africa, or similarities, perhaps, Nancy, in terms of civilization, you might say, is that development aid, in that language, made it possible for Europe, in its colonial legacy, to not have to talk about reparations. Because it said not, we owe you resources, we owe you for all the extraction we've done over centuries, that we will give up our resources and give them back to you. But rather it says we're technologically advanced, we're intellectually advanced, we're at the peak of the modernization, and hence we will teach you how to become like us, which is always an impossible project because, as Zsuzsa said, we are always changing. Right. And there's so much more I could say about this.
That's a
I do think-
disappearing horizon, so to speak. You should
Exactly.
be like us. It's always receding as we run, as Africa or whatever example you choose runs towards it. And certainly that's as different as Ukraine is also there too when one
Exactly,
speaks
and
of
I think-
corruption, as if corruption exists in Ukraine, but
Nowhere else.
not in the West. Yeah. It leads itself to the question about policy writing, whether there might be skills that we could consider teaching our students as we move forward.
Can I jump back at just a second?
Yes. if you want.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to bring some things together in terms of bringing these ideas back to where we started with populism, in the sense of, the economic insecurities, and those need not be at a national level, the nation, right? It can be at a regional level. Populism is very much that dichotomy of us versus them, right? And I think that when we think about development aid, for example, or that perhaps not the right terminology, but that's still a part of the othering, which I think that populists prey upon, right? That's the narrative. They will make the economic issue into a socio-cultural issue, and it becomes a white Christian person versus the other Black, brown, Muslim, whatever version. And I think that, that's an important thing to think about in terms of the context of values, and that really kind of is a thread throughout everything that we've said.
I think that's true.
So, Randall, do you have any thoughts about policy writing initiatives? Or am I putting I'm racing ahead? We need to pull the plug.
I think, Nancy, that we need to, we could be continuing on this conversation for so long, and we're going to have to pull the plug on this.
All right. It's great talking to all of you. I think this was a raging success. It was fascinating. I learned a great deal, and I hope that we'll have a chance to do it again.
Yeah.